Welcome into the third and final hour of America's Forum for this Friday. The controversy surrounding Speaker John Boehner's invitation to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues. 3 Democrats have said they will not attend the speech because they don't agree with the way the Speaker decided to invite the Prime Minister. But now, according to a senior Israeli official, Boehner may have misled Netanyahu into thinking the invitation was fully supported by the Democrats. All these developments prompt us to get to a conversation. Let's do so now. Let's welcome in the former Deputy Foreign Minister and Israeli Ambassador to the U.S., Danny Ayalon. Danny, it is good to have you, and we also welcome in Alan Dershowitz, the noted Harvard law professor. Alan, good to have you as well.
I'm glad to be on from Paris.
From Paris today. Well, we do appreciate that as your globetrotting continues. And Danny, I understand you're stateside in New York, so let me go to you first as the former Israeli ambassador. When we get these reports that, well, now, wait a minute, we think the invitation, there may be a misimpression about the invitation. Is that the equivalent of attempting to save face diplomatically, Danny?
That could easily be the case. And, JD, we have spoken before, and it is so unfortunate that Israel was dragged into the political fighting and acrimony between Democrats and Republicans in Washington and throughout this country. We have always enjoyed the bipartisan support of the United States, and we should never, ever meddle in or even seem to be trying to meddle in American politics. This is not to be, just as we expect nobody to meddle in our own political affairs in Israel. Allies, democracies do not do this to each other. So I hope there will be a way out. I suggested a long time ago that one way out could have been an invitation by Prime Minister Netanyahu to his opposition, to the opposition leader, the member of Knesset Herzog, that both of them make a joint appearance in Washington, and I'm sure that with this, President Obama would have welcomed both of them to the White House, neutralizing the issue of elections in Israel. But if this is not the case, certainly I would suggest to Mr. Netanyahu to stay home.
Oh, now this is really different than what we heard from you earlier, Danny, because you seem to believe that there was a place for the Prime Minister to come speak here, and you were quite strident in telling consultants and some left-leaning activist groups in the United States that were going to Israel that they ought to stay out of Israeli elections. But you're saying now, you're saying now,
JD, absolutely, absolutely, JD, and this is because at the time I also believed it was a bipartisan, a joint invitation by the Democrats and the Republicans in the House, and then it would have been their job to coordinate with the White House. It's not our job to coordinate between the different American branches of government. But now that I see that the Democrats stay away, either that they were not on the ticket to begin with, or whether they reneged because of pressure from the White House, I don't know. But now the problem is right now, JD, that the attention, instead of being on Iran and the danger from Iran, the attention is now on the relationship or lack thereof between Obama and Netanyahu. So I think for the sake of the issue, to stay on the table, for the sake of Israel-U.S. relationship, I think that that either Netanyahu should stay home or bring with him the head of opposition so they make a joint appearance here in Washington, and then also it will be a resounding message that Iran is a bipartisan issue in Israel as well.
Alan, only a minute. I had to follow up with Danny because of what I sense to be a difference there. Your take on what the former ambassador had to say?
Well, I think this is not a personality issue between Obama and Netanyahu. This is a very serious crisis about separation of powers. The president mistakenly believes that the executive has the authority to make this deal with Iran without any input from Congress. He's wrong constitutionally, he's wrong historically, he's wrong politically, and he's wrong pragmatically. And it's very important that we understand the Constitution shares the authority, and no deal with Iran ought to be allowed to go through without the approval of Congress, that is, the Senate and the House. This is very much like a treaty. And so this issue goes beyond personalities and goes to the very structure of our government itself.
And mindful of that, the separation of powers constitutionally here, of course, Ambassador Ayalon talks about the elections coming up in Israel and the larger issues. It would appear we have a polite difference of perspective, which is welcomed and encouraged. And in fact, gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to stay through the break because we want to revisit some of this and also talk about what's ahead in terms of dealing with Iran and other important issues. You stay with us, too, as America's Forum continues. Let's continue our conversation with former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Danny Ayalon, and also Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz. Both of those gentlemen joining us by telephone. Alan, you are in Paris today, but there's something that happened stateside I'd like your comment on. There was a recent meeting in the Oval Office, the president and a handful of Muslim Americans. The meeting was closed door. We just recently got the names of the attendees, and it had to do with Muslims being victimized in the United States. The president happy to sit down with those Muslim Americans, yet refusing to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu should he come to Washington. If you were advising the president on this issue, Alan, what would you tell him?
I would tell him to sit down with the president. I would tell him with the prime minister. I would tell him if he wanted to extend an invitation to either Mr. Herzog or Ms. Livni, that would be perfectly okay. But I do think the president has to go back and take a civics class about the separation of powers. He's making a dreadful mistake. He's the one who has said over and over again he wants to make sure Congress is on board. The reason he didn't attack Syria after he promised he would on chemical weapons is he said that Congress has a role to play. He can't be backing out on that. The key issue is separation of powers, the constitutional issue. He went to Harvard Law School. He was a very good student in constitutional law. He has to recall that under our Constitution, important decisions about changing relationships with countries have to transcend the power of a lame duck president for the next 1.5 years. We want our country to be able to make commitments that they will keep. And the only way to make a commitment is to make sure that Congress approves any deal the president makes. The problem is Congress may very well not approve this deal because this is a bad deal for America, a bad deal for the world, a bad deal for America's allies. And that's why it's important that Congress listen to dissenters, whether those dissenters be Henry Kissinger, who spoke in front of the House Armed Services Committee, or former Secretary Schultz, or Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's not the personalities that matter, it's the ideas and the input. The president is about to make a dreadful mistake in terms of making a deal with Iran, and a dreadful mistake in terms of trying to cut Congress off from approving that deal. And that's where the focus of attention ought to be, not on the personalities.
Danny Ayalon, I need to ask you, you were saying earlier, this is so important to keep the focus on Iran, not politics in the United States, not politics in Israel. From your vantage point, what exactly is at stake, sir?
Well, I think at stake is no less than global security and peace throughout the world, because a nuclear Iran or a nuclear or Iran which retains the potential to make a breakthrough to a nuclear weapon, to become a threshold country, that means a total new and dangerous world, because it will not stop at Iran. Iran itself, with a very nefarious ideology and with the support of terrorism by itself, a nuclear power will give it the real power to continue and commit crimes against humanity all over the world. You know, on the drawing board, they already have, they're planning an intercontinental ballistic missiles that will reach any spot on this earth, number one. Secondly, a nuclear Iran will end the proliferation regime. That means Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt already announced if they are nuclear in Iran, they will become nuclear. And what would happen here on this hemisphere with your friendly neighbor Venezuela? So this is a real threat, not just on Israel or the Saudi Saudi Arabia. It's a real threat to all Americans and all people in the world as well.
I agree with that. You know, Danny Ayalon is one of the most brilliant strategists and analysts, not only of Israeli policy, but really of international policy. And the president should take seriously what Danny Ayalon says and what many, many others have said. The president's pretty much out there alone on this issue. He has no support from Republicans and little support from Democrats. The Washington Post today, which is a liberal Democratic newspaper, had a scathing editorial against President Obama's approach to the Iran nuclear policy. The president's in a bubble on this issue, and he ought to get out of that bubble, and he ought not to be afraid to listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu or to Danny Ayalon or to Henry Kissinger, who he has never, as far as I know, met with, or to other brilliant analysts of American foreign policy, all of whom will tell him he is about to make a terrible deal for the world, for America, and for America's allies.
We will have to leave it there. Alan Dershowitz, Harvard law professor and Newsmax contributor, on the road overseas in Paris today, and former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Danny Ayalon, stateside, calling in from New York. Gentlemen, to you both, our thanks. We will be calling on you in the days ahead.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ellen, for your kind words.
Well, they're all true. They're all true.
And we're coming right back with more on America's Forum.